All right, factor by grouping. The almost the last method we use to factor. Almost. We got one more after this, substitution. But factor by grouping is a very special type of factoring. And it's pretty straightforward. So we did this before. We've talked about this with our little flow chart of factoring. So please check it out. Look it over. It's just another place that I put it. Factor by grouping. So with this method of factoring, we group terms together. Now, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say when we group, we generally group by twos. So groups of two. So whenever we have a group of terms and we want to factor them and there's more than 3, so 4 or more, there has to be an even number of terms for this to work. It just has to be. Okay, so there has to be an even number of terms because we generally group it by twos. So what we do is we take out the GCF of each group. So we break it up into groups, take out the GCF, and now we have less terms, but now they should have a binomial factor. If you grouped by 3s, then there'd be a trinomial factor. That's exactly the same. Factor out that GCF, and then see if you can factor more. So here we are. Oh my goodness, it's so exciting. Okay, there's 4 terms here. I'm going to break it up into groups of 2, which is what I'm going to do on everything, so just get used to it. So we have an x here and an x here. So we're going to think of this as one group and this as a second group. We take out the GCF of each. So this one, the GCF is x. So we factor out the x and we're left with a plus 2. Now, this next term, you got to be careful. You always have to put a sign right here. If you don't put a sign, everything, it just gets confusing to look at, and sometimes you get confused when you do it. So be careful. Whatever this sign is right here goes right there. And that is the sign of the GCF. So sometimes we will be factoring out a negative. Okay, so then we look here and we say, okay, what's the GCF here? Well, the GCF here is 3. There's no letter that's a GCF. We factor out the 3 and we're left with a plus 2. If done correctly, and it can be factored at all, you should have a binomial factor in common. So these are my 2 terms now. This should look like factoring out a GCF. We factor out the a plus 2, and we're left with the x and the plus 3 in the second, and that's it. So 4 or more terms, you factor GCF out. You group, you factor GCF out of one set, the other set, and if there's more, you factor them all out. And then you should have a binomial factor in common. You take that out in front, and whatever's left, you divide by that a plus 2, if you want to think about it that way. You divide by that a plus 2. They cancel out, and you're left with the x and the 3. Well, that's super messy. Let's try it here. Looking at this particular one, there's 4 terms again, so I'm going to break it into 2s. Looking at the first group here, the common factor, they both have x's. No numbers look like they're common factors, but they both have x's, and the smallest one is 2. So x squared is our GCF. So what's left over is x plus 3. Now this is an example where you have a minus sign right here. So that minus sign goes here. And our GCF is 4. So because we have a negative 4 right here, that's our GCF. So we have to factor out a negative 4. And we are left with x plus 3. And what that does is that basically makes it so this one and that one are the same. So take out an x plus 3, you're left with an x squared minus 4, and lo and behold, shocker of all shockers, this guy can be factored again. And hopefully you realize that it's dots, difference of 2 squares, and you're done. Just make sure that this factor right here comes down also. You don't forget about it. And then the final example that I'm going to show you, we have more than 4 terms now. but I'm still going to group it in two groups. Make sure when you're grouping, I don't really care how you separate the groups, but you should separate them. Make sure the sign on the left stays with the terms. Okay, so looking at the first two, the GCF is x squared. I know the temptation here is to combine some like terms, like I see this and this are alike. You can, it's just going to make your life a whole lot harder later. Okay, if I'm telling you to factor and I give you a thing like this, just leave it and try and factor it first. Okay, so x squared is the GCF, and I'm left with x squared minus 1. The next one here, we have a negative, so the negative goes here. And I have a 3 in common, and there's also an x in common. So divide by negative 3x. And I am left with x squared minus 1. So if you look here, it should be exactly the same, so the dividing shouldn't be too hard. Again, another negative. 10 is a GCF, so I'm dividing by negative 10, changing the sign over here. Okay, now we have 3 terms with a common factor of x squared minus 1. And then what's left over is what's left in front. So x squared minus 3x minus 10. And chances are, if I made this right, you should be able to factor these both again. Can't always do it. Some of these can't be factored again, but you need to try. So that's dots. This is a trinomial, so guess and check, or AM method, whatever you're most comfortable with. These two multiply to negative 10, and they add to negative 3. Done. Goodbye.